It was just another late-night interview, the kind that audiences have seen 100 times before. The host, charismatic and lively, would guide the conversation through light-hearted banter, the audience would laugh, and a few interesting moments would be captured for the evening's entertainment. But when Keanu Reeves walked into the studio, everything changed. He stepped out onto the stage with his usual quiet grace, but today there was something about him, something almost imperceptible yet profoundly unsettling. It wasn't his appearance. He still carried that rugged charm, the calm confidence that had made him a Hollywood icon. No, it was something in his eyes, something in the way he held himself, that made the air in the room shift. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It was something else. The host stood up to greet Keanu, pulling him into a brief hug, his smile wide and effortless. He cracked a quick joke. "Keanu, you still look like a samurai monk, or maybe a brooding guitarist from the 90s. The crowd chuckled, their laughter echoing through the studio. Keanu's lips curled into a small smile, but it never reached his eyes. The audience, usually so engaged with their beloved star, grew quiet as they noticed the difference. Keanu wasn't participating in the usual exchange of pleasantries. He didn't seem nervous, but there was an unmistakable air of distance around him. It was almost as if he wasn't entirely there. His body language was calm, but it was the calmness of someone who wasn't paying attention to the moment, someone whose thoughts were elsewhere, far beyond the lights and the cameras. As Keanu took his seat, the host began with the standard questions, keeping the energy light and playful. "Keanu, we've known you for years, and you've pretty much done it all. You still keep that cool, collected vibe, don't you?" The host laughed, as did the audience, but Keanu merely nodded, his fingers lightly tapping the table in front of him. He was already distant. The energy that usually filled these interviews was gone, replaced by something else, an unspoken tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The host seemed to notice it too. He glanced at Keanu, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to figure out what had changed. Was Keanu tired? Was he distracted? The topic shifted to something more topical, current events. "You hear the news, right? The new Pope, Robert Prevost. He's already making waves. What do you think about him, Keanu? He seems calm, collected, kind of like floating through all the attention." The host chuckled, expecting Keanu to follow up with something light and humorous, but there was a pause. A long one. Keanu's eyes were fixed on the table between them, where a glass of water sat untouched. He didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze shifted toward something else on the table, a small wooden crucifix. The crucifix was unusual. Its wooden base was cracked, the figure of Christ leaning awkwardly to one side, as if the pain it represented had made it slip out of place. It was a small detail, one that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but to Keanu, it seemed to anchor his focus, drawing him into something deeper. The host, unaware of the weight of the symbol before them, carried on. "Yeah, he's pretty different, right? The new pope always brings something fresh to the table." He took a sip from his mug, his tone light, trying to steer the conversation back to safe ground. "I mean, it's always fascinating to see how they each shape the narrative in their own way." But Keanu didn't join in. Instead, his fingers reached out slowly, almost reverently, to touch the broken crucifix. His hand lingered there for a moment, tracing the crack as if searching for something in the fracture, something that had been lost or broken beyond repair. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes seemed to have seen something no one else in the room could understand. The host's voice softened as he tried to engage Keanu again. "Keanu, are you a believer? I mean, you've played roles that have explored faith. What do you think of Prevost's approach?" Keanu didn't answer the question right away. His fingers still rested on the crucifix, as if he was gathering his thoughts, or perhaps deciding whether or not to share what he had been carrying with him for so long. "There's something about him," Keanu finally said, his voice low, almost to himself. The host leaned forward, intrigued by the sudden shift in tone. The audience, sensing that they were on the verge of something deeper than the usual celebrity chat, leaned in as well, their attention now fully on Keanu. The room had grown quieter, and Keanu's words seemed to echo across the studio. "Something about Robert Prevost," he continued, his voice filled with an emotion that was hard to pinpoint. "I've never been able to explain it. It's not about what he reminds me of, it's about what he doesn't remind me of. The words hung in the air like an enigma, and the audience, usually so comfortable with the familiar, found themselves unsettled. They couldn't place the source of their discomfort, but it was there. The host, trying to regain control of the conversation, laughed awkwardly. "What do you mean? Is he missing something?" Keanu's eyes lifted slowly, meeting the host's gaze for the first time since the interview had begun. There was no hint of humor in his expression. Keanu's words were measured as he answered, his gaze unwavering. "No, it's not that he's missing something. It's that he's empty." The room fell into a deep silence. The audience, which had been laughing just moments ago, was now dead quiet. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smile fading. "Empty," he repeated, his voice now cautious, unsure of where this conversation was heading. Keanu nodded slowly, his fingers lightly tapping the table now, as though trying to bring himself back into the present. There's a stillness to him, a quiet that doesn't seem natural. "It's like he doesn't cast a shadow," Keanu said, his voice thick with something the host couldn't place. "Like he's not really here." The host blinked, unsure of how to proceed. He had expected a light conversation about the new pope, a few opinions, maybe some humor. Instead, he found himself in the midst of a conversation that felt more like a confession. The audience, sensing the shift in atmosphere, grew still. Even the crew seemed uncertain, the hum of the studio lights dimming slightly as the conversation took a turn for the strange. The host, trying once more to steer the conversation back to something more familiar, smiled nervously. "Well, Keanu, dreams and thoughts about leaders can get a bit deep. I mean, every pope brings a new perspective, right?" Keanu's gaze didn't leave the table, but his voice, when it came, was filled with a quiet intensity that silenced the room. "It's not just about a perspective. It's about presence," Keanu said softly. "And he has none." The host's smile faltered, unsure how to respond to the heaviness in Keanu's tone. Keanu continued to stare at the table, his mind clearly elsewhere, as if something he couldn't name had finally broken through the surface. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a truth he couldn't ignore. The host sat back in his chair, the interview slipping away from the usual rhythms of celebrity interviews and into something far more unsettling. The laughter, the jokes, the easy charm, all of it had evaporated. There was only Keanu now, and the strange, haunting presence he had brought with him into the room. And as the silence stretched on, it became clear that this interview was about to become something far more than anyone had bargained for. The cameras didn't cut away, the host didn't ask the usual questions, and the audience held its breath, waiting for what was to come next. The stillness in the room hung like a dense fog, the tension palpable as Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the table. The host sat back in his chair, unsure of how to proceed, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an uncharacteristic unease. Keanu's words lingered in the air, each one seemingly weighted with layers of unspoken truths. The audience, once captivated by Keanu's usual charisma, now found themselves hanging on his every word, unsure of whether they were witnessing an actor's performance or something far more profound. The host, ever the professional, cleared his throat and leaned in slightly, trying to navigate the conversation back to more familiar waters. "Keanu," he began, his voice quieter now, "you mentioned a letter. A message. Can you tell us more about it?" Keanu didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the table, but his fingers were now gently resting on the broken crucifix, tracing the cracks in its wood. His expression was one of deep concentration, as though he were gathering the courage to reveal something he had long kept buried. The host, sensing that this was more than just a passing moment of introspection, waited patiently. The silence stretched on, the weight of the room heavy with the anticipation of what Keanu would say next. Finally, Keanu's voice broke the quiet, his words slow and deliberate, as if each one carried the gravity of years of unspoken truths. "This," Keanu began, lifting his hand slightly to gesture to the yellowed envelope sitting on the table between them, "arrived a few years ago. But I didn't open it. I wasn't allowed to." His eyes flickered briefly to the host, then back to the envelope. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, almost reverent. "I didn't know why then, but I know why now." The host, clearly intrigued, leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Who told you not to open it?" he asked, the question coming out more forcefully than he intended. But Keanu didn't seem fazed. Instead, he slowly slid the envelope closer to the host, his fingers brushing the edges of the crinkled paper as if handling something fragile, something precious. "It wasn't a who," Keanu replied softly. "It was the moment, the timing." His voice dropped even lower, as though speaking a secret he had kept hidden from the world for too long. "It came after a meeting in Rome. After that, I was handed this. No explanation, no context. Just this." He gestured again to the envelope, its edges worn and softened from years of handling. The host, now completely engrossed in the mystery, reached for it cautiously. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the symbol on the front, a cross within a circle, faint but clearly etched into the yellowing paper. "This symbol," the host murmured, more to himself than to Keanu. "What does it mean?" Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the envelope, almost as if recalling the moment it had been placed into his hands. "At the time, I thought it was a mistake," he said. "Maybe someone had sent it to the wrong person. Or maybe it was a warning. But the note inside, it made no sense. I kept it anyway." He paused, then continued, his eyes never leaving the envelope. "And now, I know that it wasn't a mistake." The host sat still, staring at the envelope in his hands, the tension building between them. He could sense that Keanu wasn't just talking about a letter. He was talking about something much larger, something that had changed the course of his life in ways the public would never understand. "What did the note say?" the host asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu's gaze shifted briefly to the audience, and for the first time since the interview began, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something akin to regret, or perhaps realization. "It said one line," Keanu replied, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "Do not read until the dove has landed." The host blinked, clearly taken aback. The audience, too, seemed to stir at the strange message, trying to make sense of it. "The dove," the host repeated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What does that mean? And why wait?" Keanu's expression darkened as he looked back at the envelope. His fingers, almost instinctively, began to trace the faint symbol on the surface again. "I didn't know then," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I think I understand now." His voice, once again, took on a quiet gravity that seemed to draw everyone into his orbit. "When the dove lands, the truth will be clear. But until then, it's not time." The host, unsure of how to continue, glanced around the room, seeking some reassurance from the production crew. But the crew was silent, their attention fixed on Keanu, waiting for him to continue. The host's voice broke the silence. "Keanu, I'm trying to understand," he said, his tone gentle now. "But this is a lot to take in. You're saying this envelope, this message, it's somehow connected to the Pope's election? To Robert Prevost?" Keanu nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "Yes," he said simply, his voice tinged with an emotion that was hard to place. "But it's more than just his election. It's about what happens next, about what is coming. I've seen it in my dreams. I felt it in my bones." The host leaned in closer, his curiosity growing. "What do you mean, Keanu? What have you seen?" Keanu's gaze darkened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he had retreated inward, lost in a memory or a vision that only he could see. "I've had the same dream every night since the day he was elected," Keanu said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm standing in St. Peter's Square. It's empty. The sky is pale, like dawn, but lifeless. And I look up at the balcony." The host, completely captivated, leaned forward, his eyes locked on Keanu's every word. "And he's there," Keanu continued, his voice barely audible. "Robert Prevost, dressed in white, smiling. But he doesn't cast a shadow. There's no darkness behind him, no outline. Just light. Too much light." The host, trying to make sense of what Keanu had just described, shook his head slightly. "But dreams are just dreams, right? They don't always mean something real." Keanu met the host's eyes then, his expression unwavering. "That's what I thought too," he said softly. "But it doesn't feel like a dream. It feels like a memory that hasn't happened yet." The host fell silent, absorbing the weight of Keanu's words. The audience, too, was silent, caught in the strange web of this conversation that seemed to transcend the boundaries of ordinary reality. The tension in the room deepened, as if they were all suspended between what was said and what was unsaid. Keanu sat still, his fingers still tracing the envelope in front of him. His eyes were distant, lost in a world the host couldn't reach. The host, still processing what Keanu had just shared, finally spoke, his voice quiet and filled with an unease he couldn't hide. "You're saying that the Pope doesn't cast a shadow in your dream, that there's no darkness behind him. What does that mean, Keanu? What is it you're trying to say?" Keanu's gaze met the host's again, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "I don't know what it means," he said softly. "But I know it's not good." He reached down, picking up the envelope once more, his fingers lingering on its surface. "And I know I've been chosen to see it, to witness it. And now, I can't ignore it anymore." The host, unable to form another question, simply sat back in his chair, his mind spinning with the weight of Keanu's words. And for the first time in the entire interview, the audience remained completely still, unable to look away. The tension in the room thickened, as if time itself had slowed. The camera crew, usually so focused on their work, now stood motionless, their attention fully drawn to the exchange between the host and Keanu. The audience, once engaged in the usual rhythms of applause and laughter, was now eerily silent, holding their breath. Every word Keanu spoke seemed to cut through the air like a blade, precise and heavy with unspoken truth. The host, trying to regain some semblance of control, cleared his throat, his voice betraying the uncertainty creeping in. "Keanu, this is a lot to take in," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to a confidant rather than an audience. "You're saying you've had dreams, visions, about the Pope, but not just any Pope. Robert Prevost. What do you think all of this means?" Keanu didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat in silence, his fingers once again tracing the edge of the envelope on the table, as if the simple act of touching it gave him some small semblance of control over the overwhelming flood of thoughts in his mind. His eyes were distant, lost in something only he could see. The host waited, unsure whether to push him further or to give him space to collect his thoughts. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice low but steady. "It's more than just a dream," he said. "It's like I'm being shown something. Something that's already happening. Something I'm supposed to see, but can't quite understand yet." His eyes met the host's, piercing and unblinking. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm standing in St. Peter's Square. It's empty. The sky is pale, and there's no life. No people, no birds. Just silence." The host leaned in, his expression now one of genuine concern. He was no longer just hosting an interview. He was listening to something far deeper, something that defied reason. "And in this dream, you see the Pope?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "Robert Prevost, but not as you'd expect." He paused, and the air around them seemed to thicken with his words. "He's standing on the balcony. He's dressed in white, just like the others before him. But something is off. He doesn't cast a shadow." Keanu's gaze drifted again, this time to the crucifix that still sat between them, its cracked wooden base reflecting the dim studio lights. "It's as if the light doesn't touch him. It passes right through him, like there's nothing there. Just light." The host, trying to make sense of what Keanu was saying, shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "So, you're saying he's not real? That he's not human?" Keanu didn't seem to notice the question as much as he seemed lost in the memory of the dream. "No," he replied softly. "It's not that. It's just that he's absent. There's no darkness behind him, no shadow, just light." He looked up, his eyes briefly meeting the host's. "That's when I knew. That's when I realized that something is wrong." The host sat back, processing the weight of Keanu's words. "And you think this has something to do with the election of Robert Prevost?" he asked. Keanu's answer came slowly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Yes, but it's not just about him. It's about what happens next." There was a shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the host could feel it. A strange, almost oppressive energy seemed to settle over the room. It wasn't just the subject matter, it was the way Keanu was speaking, the conviction in his voice. He wasn't just telling a story, he was unraveling something. Something important. You keep saying, next. What comes next, Keanu? The question hung in the air, and Keanu's eyes darkened as he turned toward the host. The dream changes, he said, his voice growing softer, almost as if he were speaking to himself now. After I see him standing there, smiling without a shadow, I hear the bells of St. Peter's Square. But they don't ring. There's no sound. The air is still. It's like the whole world has stopped. It's just me and him, and the silence. The host could feel the hair on the back of his neck rise. There was something so haunting about Keanu's words, something so real and yet so out of place in the context of a late-night talk show. And then what happens? The host asked, his voice barely a whisper. Keanu's eyes seemed to cloud over, as if he were seeing something no one else could. Then, he said, he raises his hand, and the silence deepens. It becomes a presence, like it's pressing against me, pressing against everything. His voice trembled slightly, the only sign of vulnerability that had slipped through. And then I wake up. The host stared at him, unsure of what to say. The audience, too, was silent. They were no longer watching an interview. They were witnessing something else entirely. The host's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what Keanu was describing. This is more than just a dream, isn't it? The host asked, his voice softer now, more subdued. Keanu nodded, his eyes never leaving the table in front of him. It's not a dream, he replied. It's a warning. It's like I'm being shown something I'm supposed to understand, but I can't. The host leaned forward, his expression serious. And what is that something, Keanu? What are you trying to say? Keanu finally lifted his eyes to meet the host's, his gaze unwavering. That we're being watched, he said softly. All of us, but not in the way we think. There's something coming, and it's already here. The words hit the host like a blow. He had thought they were having a light conversation, perhaps touching on the surface of some deep philosophical thoughts, but now he realized that Keanu was speaking about something far darker. The host opened his mouth to ask another question, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't speak. He couldn't find the words to bring the conversation back to safer ground. Instead, he sat there, staring at Keanu, as the weight of what had just been said settled over him. The room seemed colder now, the air thicker. Keanu wasn't just speaking cryptic words, he was revealing something that none of them could fully grasp yet. And somehow, it felt like the clock was ticking. Keanu's voice broke the silence again, but this time, it was quieter, more distant. I didn't want to talk about it, he said softly. Not to anyone. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that I'm not the only one who's seen this. I'm not the only one who's been shown something. The host, now completely caught up in the mystery unfolding before him, asked, Who else knows, Keanu? Who else has seen what you've seen? Keanu's eyes darkened, his expression pained. I don't know, he said, but I think it's bigger than just me. Bigger than just the Pope. It's something that's coming for all of us. The host looked down at the table, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of Keanu's words. But the puzzle was incomplete. There were too many missing pieces. And somehow, he knew that the answers would come too late. The room had grown unnervingly quiet, as if the world outside the studio had ceased to exist. Keanu's words still hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a shroud that no one could quite pull away from. The host, once the center of the conversation, now found himself utterly captivated by the weight of what Keanu had shared. The audience, too, was still, as if each person was struggling to reconcile the words they had just heard with the world they knew. The show, which had begun as a casual chat, now felt like a slow-moving train, heading toward a destination none of them could see. Keanu sat motionless, his eyes focused on the table in front of him. His hands, usually so calm, rested on the broken crucifix, his fingers tracing the edges of the fractured wood again. There was a certain reverence in his movement, a quiet respect, as though he were reaching out to touch something beyond the material world. The host, still grappling with the enormity of what was unfolding, finally spoke. his voice quiet and filled with a new sense of urgency. Keanu, you've shared a lot with us already, and it's clear that there's something much deeper going on here than just dreams and symbols. What exactly do you think is happening? Keanu's gaze never lifted from the table. It's not just about the dreams, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the letters. The host leaned forward, his curiosity piqued once again. The letters, he repeated. What letters are you talking about? Keanu nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. They've been coming for years, he said. Since that first one after the meeting in Rome. The host, now fully captivated by the mystery, nodded for Keanu to continue. Each letter is the same, Keanu added, his fingers lightly brushing the envelope in front of him. No return address, no name. Just a symbol, a cross inside a circle, and a message. Every time, a new message. A warning, maybe, or a sign. But it's always cryptic. The host sat back in his chair, trying to absorb the new layer of complexity that Keanu had introduced. So, you've been receiving these letters. What do they say? He asked. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the envelope in front of him and slowly slid it open, revealing another letter. This one faded and worn, the edges soft with time. This one came a few months ago, Keanu said quietly, his eyes scanning the text. It says, when the successor smiles, faith watches in silence. The host's brow furrowed. What does that mean? Who's the successor? Keanu shook his head slightly. I don't know, he said softly. But it feels like a warning, a sign that something is coming. He set the letter down gently on the table and reached for another, this one even older, its paper frayed at the edges. This one came right after the Pope's election, Keanu said. It says, the man from Lemur, the chosen one without voice. The host, leaning forward now, seemed almost to hold his breath. And who is the man from Lemur? He asked. Keanu's eyes flickered briefly, as though he were seeing something beyond the present moment. I don't know, he said, his voice distant. But I think it's someone important. Someone who will play a role in what's coming. Someone who doesn't speak. Who doesn't need to. The host's mind raced as he tried to piece the cryptic messages together. But why you? He asked, his voice uncertain. Why have these letters been sent to you? Keanu finally lifted his gaze from a table, meeting the host's eyes with an intensity that sent a chill through the room. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quiet but filled with an undeniable weight. But I think I've been chosen to witness it, to see it, even if I don't fully understand it. The host, now feeling the full force of the mystery surrounding Keanu, asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the very first revelation. What is coming, Keanu? What do you think it all means? Keanu's expression darkened, and he sat back in his chair, the weight of the letters, the dreams, and the messages pressing down on him. I think something is already happening, he said slowly. It's been happening for a long time, but now it's almost inevitable. The truth is coming to light, and when it does, we won't be able to ignore it. And when it happens, we'll all know. We'll all see it. The host's pulse quickened, sensing that this was no longer just an interview. It was something much deeper. Something that transcended the ordinary. But what is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu's eyes were distant now, as though he were seeing something that none of them could yet understand. I can't say it yet, he replied, his voice heavy with an unspoken truth. But I know it's close. And when it arrives, it won't be what anyone expects. It will be a reckoning, a change that no one is prepared for. The host leaned back, trying to process the weight of Keanu's words. But how do you know? How can you be so sure? He asked, the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Keanu's expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed with something ancient, something older than any of them could grasp. Because I've seen it, he said quietly. In my dreams, in the letters, in the silence. It's coming, and it's already here. The host, now fully aware that this interview had crossed the boundary into something far more profound, looked around the room. The crew, the audience, everyone in the studio had fallen silent. No one was moving. No one was speaking. Keanu's words had left them all frozen, as though they were all witnesses to something that would change everything. The atmosphere in the room felt suffocating now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. The host glanced at the letters on the table, the cryptic messages now taking on a chilling new significance. "What happens when it comes, Keanu?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Keanu sat up straighter, his hands resting on the table now, fingers curled around the edges of the envelope. His voice was calm, almost serene, but there was a sharp edge to it that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "When it comes," he said quietly, "we'll all know, and when it does, there will be no turning back." The host, unable to respond, just nodded slowly, as though he, too, now understood that this was no ordinary conversation. This wasn't a late-night interview. It was something far bigger. The air in the room had grown colder. The lights above seemed to flicker just slightly, as if reacting to the weight of the words being spoken. And in that moment, the host realized that he was no longer in control of this conversation. No one was. The stage, the cameras, the crew, they were all just bystanders to something much larger unfolding before them. Keanu leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him, his eyes scanning the table in front of him as if he were preparing for the next revelation. And then, just as the host opened his mouth to ask another question, Keanu spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost as if he were speaking directly to the audience rather than the host. "There's one more thing I have to show you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "One more thing that's been left for me." The host watched, breathless, as Keanu pulled out yet another envelope. This one was different, older than the others, its edges torn and its paper yellowed with age. The host felt a chill as he looked at it, wondering what would come next, knowing that whatever Keanu was about to reveal would change everything. The room was thick with anticipation, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. The host, unable to shake the feeling that this was no longer an ordinary interview, watched as Keanu slowly pulled the final envelope from his jacket. The new envelope was older than the rest, its edges worn, the paper yellowed and frayed, as though it had been passed through countless hands. Keanu's eyes, once distant, were now focused on the envelope in his hands, as if it held the last piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. The host leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What's in it, Keanu?" Keanu didn't immediately open the envelope. He just held it there, his fingers tracing the edges, the tension in his posture making it clear that this was the moment of truth. The host, feeling the gravity of the situation, was almost afraid to ask any further questions, afraid that anything he said might interrupt the quiet unfolding of something much larger than either of them could comprehend. Keanu's eyes met his once again, and for the first time in the interview, Keanu's expression softened, as though he had accepted something he couldn't change. "This letter was left for me just before the show," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a weight that only added to the mounting pressure in the room. The host remained silent, his breath shallow. The audience, too, seemed to hold their breath, as if instinctively knowing that what was about to unfold would alter everything. Keanu slowly unfolded the letter, his fingers moving with a careful reverence, as if the paper itself might crumble under the intensity of the moment. As the paper came free, Keanu began reading aloud, his voice soft but unmistakably clear. "If you show it, there is no going back." The words echoed in the silence, the meaning sinking in slowly, as if the weight of the sentence was too much to absorb in an instant. The host blinked, his mind scrambling to make sense of the cryptic message. "What does that mean?" he asked, though his voice was shaky, as though he already knew that any answer Keanu provided would lead to an even darker revelation. Keanu folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, his gaze now far away, as though he were staring beyond the walls of the studio, beyond the lights, to something only he could see. "It means," Keanu began, his voice quieter now, "that once the truth is shown, there's no turning back. No way to unsee it, no way to pretend it hasn't happened. It's like the world has already shifted, and we're just too blind to see it." The host, now visibly unsettled, swallowed hard. "But why you, Keanu? Why are these letters coming to you? Why is this happening now?" Keanu met the host's gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Because I'm the one who's been chosen to see it," he said, his voice firm now, no longer filled with uncertainty. "Not because I want to, but because I have to, and because someone has to speak it out loud. Even if it's too late. The host sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of Keanu's words seemed to press on him, and he was struck by the truth that Keanu was carrying, whether he fully understood it or not. But Keanu wasn't finished. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket once more, pulling out another letter, this one slightly different from the rest. This envelope was small, folded into quarters, the paper soft and fragile. It seemed out of place among the other letters, almost as if it didn't belong. The host could feel the coldness in the room increase, as if the temperature itself had dropped several degrees. Keanu unfolded the letter with a tenderness that made it seem almost sacred, his fingers trembling slightly as he read the words aloud. "If you reveal it, you cannot hide from what follows." The host's breath caught in his throat. The words, though simple, felt like an ultimatum, a final warning that the door to the unknown was about to be opened, and once it was, there was no way to close it again. Keanu paused after reading, his eyes scanning the letter one last time before he set it down on the table. "This is the last one," Keanu said softly. "And it's the one I wasn't sure I'd ever read aloud. But I think it's time." The host, still in shock from the revelation, felt a strange chill sweep over him. He wasn't just sitting across from Keanu anymore. He felt as though he were sitting at the edge of something much larger, something that had been building for years, something that no one could stop. "What's the last thing it says, Keanu?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Keanu folded the letter one final time, his expression hardening. "It says," Keanu began, his voice taking on a darker tone, "if the voice of faith becomes only an echo, the truth will die in silence." He looked up at the host, his eyes cold and certain. "There are those who will wear the robes, but not the burden. They will speak the words, but they will not know their weight. You will know them by the spaces between their answers." The host sat in stunned silence, the implications of what Keanu had just read beginning to sink in. It wasn't just about the Pope, or the mysterious letters, or even Keanu's strange dreams. It was about something far bigger, something that transcended all of them. "And what does that mean?" the host asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. Keanu's voice was quieter now, almost mournful. "It means that silence is as dangerous as any lie. It means that the truth is already here, but it's hidden beneath layers of denial. And when it's finally revealed, we won't be able to stop it." He stood up slowly, the weight of his words filling the studio. "But it won't matter, because when the truth comes, it's not about what we've known. It's about what we choose to do with it." The host remained frozen in his seat, unable to move or speak. The audience, too, was still, unsure of how to respond to the gravity of Keanu's words. The lights above the stage flickered for a moment, the faint hum of electricity filling the silence, as if the very studio itself was reacting to the magnitude of what had been said. Keanu turned, his steps deliberate, as though he knew that what he had shared with the world couldn't be taken back. As he reached the exit, he paused, his hand on the door, and looked back at the host. "Remember," he said softly, "you can't unsee it. None of us can." And with that, he walked out of the studio, leaving the host and the audience behind in the stillness that followed. The room remained frozen for several long moments. The host looked down at the letters on the table, the messages now an inescapable reality that hung over them all. He knew that this interview, this conversation, was never meant to be aired. But it had been, because the truth had to be shared, even if it was too late. The host let out a slow breath, and for the first time in his career, he didn't know how to continue. And in the silence that followed, the weight of Keanu's words pressed down on them all. The world, it seemed, had already begun to shift. The truth was coming, and nothing would ever be the same.